Very warm welcome to today's session. And this is our really a customary session where we have between the lines session once a quarter religiously now for more than a year. Uh, and we have got some really encouraging feedback, Advait, from members who regularly attend this, though the participation numbers certainly should and can go up. But I think with so many webinars happening all around, perhaps people have got that boredom. But we have historically also seen that more and more people do join in, as the session goes along. So once again, a warm welcome to everyone and the esteemed panelists and Advait for anchoring today's session. And today's topic is really the most talked after topic in a post-pandemic scenario where NASCOM and all sorts of studies have really reflected that gig economy and gig workers would really yeah, rise, and organizations really need to rethink their model around which they would engage with their employees. So I'm really looking forward to an engaging conversation with our esteemed panelists. And with that, I'll hand this over to you, Advait, to take us through today's session.
Thanks, Samir, and thanks, HIA, and good to be back, although in a electronic way once again for HIA. My name is Advait Kurlekar. My colleague here, who will take over from me now soon, is Eklavya Malhotra. And for people who have joined for the first time, we represent a consulting company based in Pune called Apohan Management Consultants. And we have been doing this program called Between the Lines for over nearly 4 years now, each month. And with HIA, Samir, it's yes, definitely more than 1 year. In fact, this is our 8th program together. So it's been 2 years now. So thank you, HIA.
Time
And
flies.
yeah, so this is our 8th Between the Lines program for Hinjawadi Industries Association. Format of the program is every program we identify a book that we believe is a good book to read or has got recently launched and is of a relevant topic for HI members. And my colleague Eklavya takes us through a quick summary of that book, just to so that without reading the book, we know what the book is all about. And every book obviously has insights. The topic obviously has so much to talk about, and we invite veteran people from the industry, and I moderate a panel discussion on the topic. So as you can see on your screen, today's topic obviously is on gig economy and whether gig is the future of economy. And from now, for the next maybe 20-25 minutes, Eklavya will take us through the book summary, and then I'll come back, formally introduce our panelists, and we will start the discussion for an hour or so. So we hope to finish by about 5 o'clock today evening. So thanks once again, Samir, Nilesh, Colonel Saab, and everybody else at HI. Thanks for the panelists, and of course I'll come back again. But over to you, Eklavya.
Thank you so much, Advait. So, like Samir mentioned, today's topic is perhaps of great interest to everybody, us included, because truly this is one of those areas which is essentially shaping the future of work. So in terms of, there's so much talk that keeps happening. What is the future of work? What is the workplace of the future going to look like? Now, in fact, there is also increasingly a discussion that is taking place that is there going to be a workplace in the future itself? So these are all existential questions that businesses today are probably, I wouldn't say that they are struggling to answer these, but increasingly it's coming out more and more in discussions that how do we really leverage something which came about as yet another jargon from Silicon Valley, but probably something that we have in our own economy. In the Indian context, we've had this for maybe many, many decades now, what we like to call the gig workforce or the gig economy. But as is typical for Indian management circles, and the intellectual largesse, until it comes from the West, we refuse to accept it as a viable theory or a viable business model or a framework. For some reason, we really need that stamp which comes from Silicon Valley before we, openly acknowledge and embrace a new concept to the fullest. And now it's good to know that, again, one of the things that we could have done when Samir brought this topic to our attention last month, that let's do something on the gig economy. The easiest thing would have been to do that very popular bestseller, which is called Gigged. I think just about anybody and everybody who frequents Amazon, or if you are still of a certain vintage and you like to visit your neighborhood bookstore, you would have seen it on the bestsellers list. So that's one of the books that would have been easiest for us to pick up and do a summary, because that's probably like, one of those holy grails of gig economy nowadays. You talk about the topic, you read online, that's the one book that always gets cited. But we didn't want to do that. We again wanted to look at it only typically from the Indian context. In fact, I'm hopeful that I'll be able to get through the entire presentation without mentioning Uber, Airbnb, Lyft, and all the usual suspects, because I think that would be highly unfair to Ola, Oyo, Make My Trip, and so many other stalwarts who have also taken this concept and they have managed to show us in terms of how do you utilize that to the fullest. So we picked up on this book, which was recently released. In fact, just a few months ago during the pandemic, it came about. So it doesn't get more topical or recent than this. It's called Gig Economy in India Rising, and it's a book by Amitava Ghosh, whose credentials really speak for itself. So the good thing, like about the book, is that it is written by somebody who is at the helm of spearheading an entire gig workforce at one of the largest proponents of the same, which is Ola Cabs. So he's the director HR for employee relations and compliance, the two things that get discussed the most when it comes to what are the problems that are ailing today's gig workforce. So he's a man whose opinion really matters on that front. So, we thought that there could not be a better or a more ideal candidate. And luckily for us, he has written a book. It's a very well researched book. He clearly comes out as, as a very academic theorist. And he's also somebody who has presented papers on the emerging, the blue collar workforce at international conventions in Geneva, Barcelona, Philadelphia, and a few other places. So he really is somewhat of an authority when it comes to speaking on this particular topic. And in fact, we had spoken to him a few times over the phone last week. We'd exchanged correspondence, and he was going to join us today to share his thoughts on the book as well and what led to him writing it. But unfortunately, personal, somebody in the family is extremely unwell, so he had to go back to his hometown, and that's the reason why he's not able to join us today. But notwithstanding, the other thing that is quite remarkable, and I had made it a point that I'll try and remember this and I'll share this whenever we speak about this book, that it's one of those books where the proceeds, the entire proceeds from the sale of this particular book are going to a charity. It is a charity where Mr. Ghosh is on the board of it. It's called No Hungry Child. It's based in Bangalore. And especially during the pandemic, they're doing a stellar job of ensuring that no child goes hungry, and especially physically, visually, mentally challenged children who reside in Bangalore homes. They are taking great pains to ensure that all of them are fed. And this book is going to obviously, hopefully, go a long way in contributing to that front. So that's about the man himself. And now coming on to the topic. So this is, in fact, a quote that is, I think, in the very first chapter, Amitava has used this quotation to drive home the point that why is it so important, or why is it that all of us are talking so much about gig economy? Again, I knew that I wouldn't talk about any international lofty examples, but what Zipcar, which again is one of those companies that has really utilized this particular business model, or at least workforce management model to great effect. The co-founder had this absolutely brilliant insight to share, and I think most of us would agree to this. A lot of us would have also seen this, that the amount of ease with which people nowadays are able to first and foremost switch jobs. And I know that in these forums we have spoken a lot about that when we did a session earlier on millennialism also some time back. But it's also like, not just about jumping jobs with increasing and alarming regularity depending on, what side of 40 you're on. But nowadays, it's also about handling multiple jobs at the same time. And in today's day and age, maybe thanks to Corona, I did not think that one would ever say thanks to Corona in a sentence. But yeah, maybe on account of the pandemic, it's increasingly becoming common to see that in India as well. We never really saw that in India, that somebody would be shuffling 2 or 3 jobs at the same time to make ends meet or to supplement their primary source of income. So, what they call a side hustle. But we are seeing that even on our shores nowadays, that people are really sort of jumping onto this gig economy bandwagon. And what is coming out as a new and somewhat surprising feature is that it's no longer limited to the blue collar workforce, who typically, because of being semi skilled or unskilled, they largely had no other option but to be part of this gig economy or the gig workforce. But now we are seeing increasingly that there is greater acceptance and traction that is emerging within the white collar workforce as well. So that is something which has obviously spurred the desire to write this book for Amitabha. And again, there is no looking back in terms of, gig economy being the future and being here to stay. Now, one of the interesting things that I did not know about earlier and I learned courtesy the book was that how do you identify whether there is, whether you are a gig worker or not, or whether you are eligible to be retained as a full-time employee, or should you be under the legal status of a gig worker or a freelancer. So this is known as the ABC test, and I think this was back in 2018. He mentions in the book that there was a landmark ruling in Los Angeles, and over there was a court case which was going on against basically the union, or rather the unorganized union of a courier company, which was basically into logistics. So they were using these gig workers, as they like to call it, for making all the deliveries, which were basically the company's core operating model. They were like any other logistics company, like we have Delivery, we have ExpressBees, or any of these other startups. So over there, it was a case which was basically that the workers felt that they were unfairly being classified as gig workers, and hence they were not able to have access to any of the social security or welfare benefits or employment rights. And they had this case where the ruling came about that you can only use, or you can only tag somebody as a gig worker for your organization if they fulfill all three of these criteria. Now, this got to be known as the ABC test, because there was a certain acronym which was used. So ABC test essentially is about, first and foremost, that is the worker really free? Is it really a free and independent job? Because again, if you look at it, the entire thing about gig economy or the gig workforce, it's always meant to, it always alludes to the basic fact that I am my own boss. I choose when to work and who to work for. Now, is that really truly the case? That's the first condition which needs to be fulfilled. The second one is that whatever work that is being performed by this particular category of worker, it has to be outside the usual course of the business. That means it cannot be your core operations. So this again, and understandably so, you can imagine the kind of problems that it created for the industry in California, especially when this ruling was passed, because suddenly a lot of companies that were outsourcing their core operations to people who were not on the payrolls, and hence they were being deprived of certain legal benefits, certain employment rights. Now they had to rethink their entire business model. And the last one was that the worker has to be engaged in some kind of an independent trade or some kind of business which is the same nature of work as that is performed by the company that is, it's like saying that I anyway need to be a graphic designer, and then I should be able to extend my graphic designing services to maybe some kind of a media company or some company that is into communications or some company that is looking out, that is actually looking at work within the same space. So there has to be a like to like kind of skills overlap, which again, most of the cases, it was not there. So all of these conditions being fulfilled, that was the only way in which one could then be classified as a gig worker. So this became a landmark ruling. And to this date, it has divided a lot of opinions within the HR fraternity, definitely, in terms of, what do we do with the workforce that typically was not supposed to be on our rolls. We were not supposed to be looking out for them per se. And now suddenly they are somebody that we need to be looking into more actively, giving them certain benefits. What does it mean for compensation costs? So all of this is basically something which is, uh, which has basically thwarted the rise of the gig economy out there. But in India, because of, again, one can say that, the way in which rules get interpreted loosely, and the fact that, again, the labor supply and demand mismatch, India has not really seen any sort of erosion of any sort in terms of, or I would say not seen any uprising of any significant sort yet when it comes to the rising gig workforce. And even now, as recent as I think 2019, when Ernst& Young had conducted a survey in association with, I believe, NASSCOM and FICCI, one of the key findings of the report was that 24% of the world's gig workforce is actually coming from India itself. So these are, of course, staggering numbers, and I'm sure that they continue to rise as we speak. Now, COVID obviously has sort of put to lay this, like all the plans of the gig economy in terms of what was coming up. All those plans have really been put to bed now. If you see some of the major industries where the gig workforce was typically employed, those are probably among the hardest hit. So we've got aviation, we've got hospitality, retail to a great extent. So all industries which were typically, and of course, ride sharing services, a lot of these, which were tech enabled, they have seen a complete stop in terms of complete cessation of their operations for a few months or at least a few weeks. And during that time, they also took it as as a good excuse, some might say, to basically reduce manpower totally, whether it was their own manpower or it was the people who were freelancing for them. And all of this was like, of course, on the back of a very weak and muted consumer demand. So there's not much that could have been in terms of that could have been different for these companies also. But what has also come about in the last few months, very surprisingly, so there was a something which even Amitava has pointed out in the book. He has written that all of this, and again, mind you, that this book came about during September. I think September it released. So that time demand was coming up, but it was still not sustainable. At least that's what people were saying. But what has happened also surprisingly is that there are a number of people now, a huge uptick in the number of people who are leaving their normal professional jobs and they are signing up to be gig workers in that sense. So a lot of people are signing up for freelancing jobs, and this is something which has caught everybody's imagination. There are a lot of articles and surveys that have been floating around in the last couple of weeks or months, which are talking about anything like, I think the last statistic was some 72% upswing in the number of white collar people who have now taken up gig jobs rather than continuing in their normal jobs. So they have resigned from their usual activities. And again, this is more within the IT sector, which probably makes it all the more pertinent for our panelists to probably lend some insights into what could be driving this kind of a resurgence in the gig workforce, even though by any stretch of imagination, by any yardstick, we are still in the midst of a global pandemic. There is still uncertainty, and yet a lot more people are actually going out of the way to make their lives even more uncertain by signing up for this. So, in a way, are we romanticizing this whole gig economy a bit too much? That is probably one of the questions which is not answered in the book completely, because again, the book is more of a theoretical discourse. But this is something which, of course, after reading this, or even generally being aware of what's happening in this area of late, it leads one to wonder that, is the gig economy going the startup route, where everybody was so much in love with startups that they were looking at, quitting their jobs and joining a startup or co-founding a startup. So is it the same kind of phenomena that we're witnessing now, that people have suddenly discovered that, oh, there is something called a new normal, we have to regain control of our work life balance, it has to be more of life work balance, I need to be my own master, I should not be answerable to anyone, I need to pursue my passion. Not sure what it is exactly that is driving it up, but clearly something seems to have changed in the last 2 or 3 months. And then again, one of the biggest myths that comes to gig economy, and even as part of the book, it has been cited that it's a misnomer to think that gig economy and startups go hand in hand, and it is not for anybody else, it is not for traditional organizations. That is clearly not the case. uh, it's increasingly becoming a part of your talent management strategy. Professional services firms, like our firm for itself, a consulting firm. We've got Deepak over here who will probably be able to tell us way more in terms of how professional services firms are looking to integrate gig workers within their teams, within their consulting teams at large. And then, of course, you have these mega corporates which are looking to drive certain specific agenda, certain transformational initiatives or projects using only gig workers who come in for a very specific task, very time bound project, and that's it. They do the work, they lend their expertise, and then they move out onto the next thing. And of course, startups are always looking to hire independent gig workers or freelancers, because they obviously there is a limitation in terms of the ability to pay and how much of their manpower cost can they really inflate while they're still in that startup or gestation stage. So if you look at it in terms of what are the key skills, because I think that's what a lot of us are curious to know about, that today if I'm working in my organization, and if I'm thinking of perhaps leaving it, branching out on my own, within my domain, within my function, what are those skill sets that are pretty much in demand right now when it comes to, like, in the context of the gig workforce or the gig economy? So these are just some of those indicative areas which are being talked about more than other areas. This is not to say that, beyond these functions or beyond these skill sets, you cannot really venture out on your own. I'm sure that there are multiple things which have not been covered under this. But what's important is that even in something like HR, there are many areas, because I know that a lot of us who have joined in on the call today belong to the HR function. So we would be interesting, like it would be interesting for us to look at some of these areas, that even organizational development and employee engagement, two areas which are so intrinsic to any good HR function, it seems that even these areas are now increasingly becoming open for people to come in from the outside on a very project based kind of a, like agenda. And the gig workforce can also look at, looking at basically perhaps plugging some gaps within these areas as well. And this is not something which one would expect typically, because OD and engagement are things that a company would like to keep very close to its heart, given the kind of strategic importance that it usually has. So clearly there is something which is happening in terms of acceptability, and people are looking at expanding the talent pool. And when we say talent pool, that itself becomes a very, very difficult question to answer, that what exactly is talent? Because on one hand, we've always had this traditional definition of talent, which was organization led, which was defined in terms of the way the organization was classifying who really its employees are. And now it's becoming more and more open. It's becoming a bit ambiguous as well, because it is employee driven. So if you look at it from the old from the old co kind of an organization perspective where you had full-time employees, part-time employees, and sometimes contractors, to now where increasingly you have freelancers, you have gig workers, you have crowdsourcing. So the entire spectrum of what does talent exactly mean, now it has become a spectrum of a definition rather than being a very siloed definition of sorts. So this itself, probably increases the challenge, or sort of ensures that HR really has to be alert and on its toes, because people who were typically not part of your organization earlier, who were just there in terms of some kind of a contractual or a legal paper of sorts, now you have to be concerned about integrating them also. So all the talk that we like to do in terms of shared values, cultural integration, all of that now has to get broad based to include yet another chunk of population which was earlier outside of the entire gamut of HR activities. So that's something which I'm sure again Advait will highlight during the panel discussion, and it will be interesting to see that what can we do really as HR professionals in order to drive this change agenda. So yeah, as much as we would like to sit back and talk about the gig economy being the answer to India's unemployment crisis, not everything is hunky-dory within this area as well. You don't have any capping on the minimum wages. You don't have any rights that are accorded to this set of people. They can, yeah, they have to forego any semblance of social security benefits, provident fund, insurance, any medical benefits. Oftentimes, they are forced to work very long or odd hours. And as is the case in most other sectors in the employment space, there is a gender inequality. There aren't as many women who are able to enter this kind of this kind of a temporary freelance based work economy. And although again that is also changing slightly, but even in areas where it is changing, studies indicate that even if there is gender parity, it will never be equality in terms of the pay scale. They are being paid 8 to 10% lower than men for the exact same job. So yeah, there's lots to correct over here, but there is still some hope, and that has come about in the form of the Social Security Code, which is going to become a law in the months to come. And this is something which, even according to the author, is likely to be one of the biggest game changer. So basically, the Social Security Code, as I'm sure all of us are now very well aware, it's looking at merging about 8 or 9 existing labor laws, uh, and creating one single code, one single law, which will help to control the labor market in the informal sector in India. So the Social Security Code is now finally going to offer some legality, some legal status to people who are otherwise termed as gig workers. And they are now going to derive certain benefits. So that entire process of database creation, the entire process of registering with the government in terms of, registering your Aadhaar and all those things, that's ongoing right now. So in the months to come, there is surely going to be a massive disruption which will be witnessed. Although again, the jury is still out in terms of the long-term impact and whether enough has been put into the Social Security Code to make it meaty enough, or is it just going to be something which will provide a little bit of benefits but not really give any long-term shape to this informal sector? That remains to be seen. And a lot of organizations anyway right now are up in arms against the Social Security Code and also the wages code as well, which is going to be one of the 4 major things that are going to happen this year in terms of the labor law regulation changes. So a lot of companies are up in arms because they are saying that it's going to increase the compensation cost. But at the same time, rightly so, people who belong to this kind of an informal sector, they are looking forward to it, hoping that there is going to be some kind of security which is given to them. So it's going to have some kind of a disproportionate impact, that is for sure. And I'm not going to get too much into this, but just to mention that if this book, I think the book was about 200 pages long, and I was mentioning to Advait that nearly 120, 130 of those pages was devoted only to the social security code and the interpretation of what it means for the workforce of the future. Just to put in context how important this is. So that's it about the book context setting in terms of what gig economy in India is all about and where we stand today. And of course, there is no looking back right now. It's not really a time to ask whether the gig economy is going to find acceptance in India. Like, are we really looking at adopting this because it's already here, it's here to stay? And to understand more about what exactly it means for us, especially within the IT domain and within the HR fraternity, we've got a wonderful set of panelists who are going to give us their insights, their opinions, and hopefully some much needed advice as well. So over to Advait for the main feature of the session. My name is Eklavya Malhotra, and thank you all for listening in.
Thanks, Eklavya, for your gig. And it brings me to the main part of today's discussion, and a privilege and honor to formally introduce our panelists today. So to start with, happy to introduce Dr. Deepak Gupta, DG as I call him, old friend, old colleague from PwC when we were together in India. He has more than 2 decades of experience in the consulting space, and he's a business psychologist, management consultant, worked in PwC in India and in the UAE, worked in Confery there, and Mercer, and now he's back in India and working as a client partner in Confery in their Gurgaon office. He has huge experience in the OD space, whether it's leadership assessment, career planning, succession planning, and HR consulting and HR strategy. So thanks, DG, for sparing your time today for this session, and welcome to the panel. If anybody still has any doubts in terms of whether this gig thing is relevant for India, or is it just still theory, happy to introduce Sahil Sharma. He is the co-founder and CEO of a Pune-based startup called What Else? Gig India. And he did that while still studying in his final year in PICT. Uh, Gig India as a startup, and we just saw a few slides ago that it is not just related to startups, but here is a startup for gigs. And they have already done some 35 million gigs for over 100 plus corporates, covering 7.5 lakh gig workers in more than 200 cities in the last 4 years since they've been in operation. He was part of our Nurture Accelerator program as part of TAI Pune, and that's how I got to know him. And I'm closely following him and the wonderful progress he and his company has been doing. Recently, they've got funded close to more than $1 million from Incubate Fund India, and also individual marquee investors like Mr. Amodarai from TCS, Kiran Deshpande from Tech Mahindra, and Anjali Bansal from Avana Capital. So thanks, Sahil, and I look forward to hearing your views because you are day in and day out, nothing but gigs. So thanks for coming in, and thanks for spending your time here.
Thank you, Advait.
Last but not the least, we have Shirish Bavdekar, who also has more than 2 decades of experience in technology companies, including Capgemini, Tech Mahindra, NS. Currently, he is the head of talent acquisition in Dassault Systems, the Indian arm, which looks after R&D and the services for global organization. In Dassault, he has been generally responsible for talent acquisition and strategy, and drive business plan and operational excellence in the organization. And he is now actively looking at different channels and different sources for talent acquisition. And I look forward, Shirish, to your views in terms of how are you integrating this gig side to your talent acquisition pipeline. And thanks again for sparing your time, and look forward to your inputs.
Sure, Advait. Thanks.
Great. So maybe DG, I'll start with you. Without getting into the legality of it, what's your own practical definition of what is a gig worker, and how is it different? And let's keep the discussion specific to white collar and IT perhaps, And how is it different from freelancers or consultants who work with IT? Or is it just a new term, old wine, new bottle kind of thing?
Well, thank you very much, Advait, and good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Let me go back to the origins of the word gig. And what that meant was that while you had a day job, in order to supplement your income for whatever reasons, you would take on specific projects. And the idea was that, hey, I want to make side hustle. I think Eklavya mentioned that in his book review. So it was all about the side hustles. How do I make extra money? And those of us who've studied and lived abroad during our student days, while we were studying, even though we may have been on fellowships, we did side hustles because we wanted that extra whatever, bunch of change to do whatever the heck that we wanted to do. So
the typical 20 hours per week kind of.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that is the original definition of what a gig worker is all about. Now, yes, and I would like to stick to that definition, that for me, a gig worker is somebody who's got a job, but is doing things on the side. But that having said, over the years, it has mutated, pretty much like the damn COVID is mutating as we speak. And what's happened now is that there are people out there, we call them freelancers, who are working on, let's say, 2, 3, or 4 or 5, depending on their own sort of level of comfort, on projects, specific projects. And that's where I like to draw a difference. So as a contract worker, I have a single job.
Yeah.
Right. Does that qualify me to be a gig worker? I'm not sure. I have a question mark on that.
Yeah.
As a freelancer, as an entrepreneur, I'm running let's say a carry and a forward business, right? I'm a CNFA agent and I distribute a couple of products. Does that make me a gig worker? Again, I put a question mark to that. And thankfully, you do sort of allude to the point that let's look at the tech space. Now, in the tech space, I'm a freelancer, but I work on specific projects. The moment my project and my commitments towards that project is over, I go and do something else, or I could be doing 2 projects at the same time.
Yeah.
Of course, depending on the nature of those projects, right? So that to me is the is the classic gig worker. Now, if you look at the difference,
so you're saying 2 projects with 2 different clients.
Yeah, it could be 2 projects, 3 projects. I mean, it really depends on your bandwidth, the nature of the projects, and so on and so forth. But you're doing these multiple engagements, right? It's not a 2-year or a 3-year or a 6-month sort of single contract with a client, because that puts you in the contract category.
Yeah.
So I think that's the subtle difference that one would like to work with.
Sure.
That having said, of all the data that I have, trolled through, the Indian gig economy is worth so much. It is, well, it's growing at 17 or 14%. Fine, that nobody would want to debate. But the exact, who qualifies for the gig worker and what is that size is still a bit of a gray area, because I think it's taking into account a huge spectrum of people. So it's looking at, and I think Eklavya mentioned this, it could be sort of part-time workers, it's entrepreneurs, freelancers, contract workers, and somewhere you also have those gig workers. If you start paring that down, go back to the classical definition, I think it'll just help us as a country and as managers of businesses to have a more focused view of how do we engage. How do we more than engage? Why do we want gig worker? I think that's a big question, but I'll stop here.
Okay, I'll come back to that. Shirish, coming to you, what's your take in terms of how do you look, as a talent acquisition person in an engineering IT services kind of company? How do you look at what's your own definition of gig? You would have freelancers, you would have consultants, you of course have employees. Do you really have gig workers, or how do you look at them?
Yeah, thanks, Advait. So coming from a R&D context, yes, there are certain challenges comes in terms of typical protocols being followed at a global level, as well as, of course, the product IPs. Having said that, there are a couple of roles, for example, specifically talking about, say, UX designers or a technical writer. Now, these kind of roles where you could definitely see that there is a potential wherein you can definitely look at typically, gig kind of competency and worker. While only one approach needs to be looked at is, can we look at typically engaging them from a contribution perspective, is output-based perspective, rather than engaging them only looking at whether they are partly available to us or whether they are available to us for a specific duration. It should be more of an outcome one. That is one of the approach we are working on.
Sure.
Having said that, one of the experience I can share with all of you is from a services perspective. I could see typical this approach being picked up at a mid to senior level. Recently, I have engaged with one of the lady who comes with a very good experience in a program management, project management from a specific PLM domain. And yeah, because of her experience throughout this last more than 2 decades, she doesn't want to get into employment. Neither we are quite comfortable to get into the kind of a specific contract or contract employee because of the nature of the services. Having said that, we also got into a kind of a midway to see how we can use the concept of definitely the gig economy and typically the gig kind of competency, how we can bring it together. And we got into a median way to see how we can engage and use her competency as a output based driven from services standpoint, and still engage her for a specific output for a, say, specific limited to the 4 or 3 working hours or specific hours within the week. And
Okay.
and she is still free to do her job within her remaining time slot. Of course,
Sure.
keeping certain NDAs signed.
Yeah.
But I think a trend is definitely moving towards one, as you rightly mentioned. No question whether industry is ready to accept the concept or not. It's more of possibly we have to tweak it based on the ecosystem what each one of us are working with.
Sure. Just a sub question on that, Shirish. You mentioned NDAs, of course, but are you allowing or disallowing her from doing something else while she's also working for those 3-4 hours a day?
We do allow, as long as that does not unnecessarily conflict with the NDA. Of course, we do allow. I mean, it's up to her.
So is there a non-compete is what I'm trying to ask you?
Yeah, we do allow her. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks. I'll come back to you on that.
Sure.
Sahil, before I ask you any specific question, for the audience, it might make sense if you start to sort of explain what Gig India is all about, because we've been talking of gig and you're in this business for 4 years. So it might be really a fascinating story that you have for all of us to sort of understand. So I'm giving you a sales pitch, yeah. You're on mute, Sahil.
I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, Advait. I think when we say what Gig India does, we say that we are in the business of making life easier, especially for HR folks, right? Because the whole concept of scaling down is a headache, right? I was going through what Eklavya was mentioning, that scaling up is easy, right? You can traditionally add more people, but we all have gone through this last very tough year that we had, where scaling down was a challenge, right? Now, wherever there was a higher percentage of gig workers, the impact to the business was a bit low, right? And wherever you had more percentage of full-time workers, there the challenge was higher. The HRs were more, stressed out. So when we say what Gig India does, we are making life easier for HRs by not providing workforce, but getting the work done. So we don't sell workforce, but we get it done through a network of gig workers. On our platform, we have a very highly curated, pre-screened, pre-trained pool of gig workers. So any enterprise looking for some work for a 3 to 6 month period of time, or they're looking for a longer period of time, can easily just sign up on the website, share their work requirement, and it gets assigned to the right gig worker.
So do you have any qualification that what constitutes a gig for you for Gig India?
Yes. gig economy is broadly divided into three categories. White collar, blue collar is very simple to understand. White collar is where you need expertise into that kind of a skill. Blue collar is where you don't need expertise. Anybody can do that job. We are in the mid skill section where you don't need expertise, but you need to have a moderate educational degree. But you can learn on the job. So any kind of work where you need people who are moderately educated and can learn on the job, that is the kind of work that we usually take up. So it's
So,
mostly around
without obviously losing on the confidentiality part, can you give us one or two examples of what constitutes gig for you from a gig worker perspective or from your client's corporate's perspective? A typical gig kind of thing.
Yeah, I think one of the points that Shirish mentioned was that a highlight of this gig economy part is where you pay for outcome, right? So for us, a gig is a task which can be quantified. So it's not
Okay.
like writing, building a product. That's not a gig, right? But writing a piece of content or making a sales pitch or giving a demo to a prospective client or onboarding a customer. So these are quantifiable tasks.
Okay.
So that's a gig for us.
So it will have a start time and an end time. So it's a defined time period kind of thing.
Yes. So for example, if you want to onboard about 1,000 customers onto your platform, you can distribute it amongst 100 gig workers. Tell them that each of you have to onboard 10 customers. Each customer onboarded is a gig. It's a task completed, and you get paid for what you actually complete. So
Okay.
that's how it is. That's how
Fair
it
enough.
works.
Fair enough. So thanks, Sahil. And so there's no definition you have in terms of who qualifies or whatever.
I would say that at Gig India, it is one, the unit of work should be quantifiable. The level of skill should be from low to mid, and the basic unit of work should be it should have the possibility to get completed within less than
So,
24 hours.
so there's this term called moonlighting, you know, that I work in a company Monday to Friday, I have my weekends free and I do gigs that also pay me.
Yeah.
Are you allowing those kind of things, or
Yes.
are you even concerned about this, or?
No, it's not a function of our concern because all we care about is the demand that we get from our enterprise customers, how we distribute it across a network of gig workers. A particular gig worker might decide that, hey, I want to work for all 40 hours a week on these tasks. Somebody might decide that I just want to work for 4 hours, and it is distributed accordingly.
Okay, but what happens when I moonlight and there is a challenge or a concern from my employer that how come he's earning money on the side? Are you liable for that? I mean, we are getting into the legalities of it, but might as well do that now.
Sorry, Advait, I think I lost you.
No, so what happens when I'm moonlighting and my employer comes to know that I'm doing this on the side, earning money also? Are you concerned about it?
No, so yeah, so we don't
Sorry if
at
it's
Gig
a
India.
slightly difficult question or a awkward question, but
No, no, it is absolutely fine. It is actually the responsibility of the gig worker, right? If their
okay,
current contract with their existing organization does not allow them, then
sure,
they are going to get into trouble, right?
sure,
So we
sure.
do ask them during the curation process whether are you currently employed, and if they are currently employed, we do ask them that what is the current arrangement with the current organization,
Yeah,
and if
okay,
that does not allow you to do this, then we don't onboard them.
okay. So you qualify that kind of thing.
Yes.
Yeah, fair enough. Deepak, your expression said that you had some views on this topic, so let me come
No,
back
no,
to you.
I agree with what Sahil said. Um, if my gig, right, whether it's moonlighting, weekends, or whatever, if it does not conflict with my day job, um, most organizations don't have an issue. But let's say if
Okay.
I'm in the advisory business and I'm moonlighting on the side, then
Yeah,
clearly I am in breach,
yeah,
right? And I think there are enough and more laws in India to take care of that breach.
sure.
But if I like baking and I bake on the weekends and I generate some revenue out of that, Conferry has absolutely no problem with it.
Yeah, I forgot to mention the introduction about your wood carving hobby.
Yeah,
Okay,
so I mean, that's a simple one.
okay.
But you see, the issue So you are saying, so there's a qualifying condition that there's a people who have a day job and who are doing gigs on the side.
Yeah.
So that's, but if you look at what are being called as gig workers today, they don't have a day job.
Yeah.
All they do is they do multiple gigs.
True. True.
Right. And that's,
Eklavya did mention in his presentation he doesn't want to talk too much about Uber, etc. But the book is by Ola author. But,
I'm not even talking about the Ubers.
No. What I'm saying is the original Uber idea was that I have a day job and in the evenings I pick up my car and do some trips and make some money. That was the original idea.
Yeah, you're right.
So that's a pure gig.
That's right. That is the pure gig. That's the classic gig. But today you have a situation, whether that's been accelerated because of the pandemic, because of the fact that there are tech-enabled platforms which are bringing both buyers and service providers closer, etc., etc. You do have this lifestyle where you say, I don't want to be in a full-time in an FTE environment. I'm quite happy taking on project specific, and as Shirish rightly mentioned, outcome focused jobs or activities to be delivered. And that is where the gray area kicks in. Especially when you're looking at, let's say, some of the skill sets, whether it is let's say UX design, whether it's content writing, right? When you're doing it with one client and then you start sort of peddling the same experience, not really the skill, but the experience, the learnings from what is happening at one client, and you start doing it with another sort of customer, those are the gray areas. And I don't think anybody is beginning to even think about, but they will certainly be the going forward, the pain points. How do you sort of arrest some of that leakages?
Sure.
Now, the argument that's already happening in some of the states in the US, California being right at the top, they're saying, I am free to peddle my experience. Right now, okay. So again, you get into a gray area, the dividing line between what constitutes experience, but that experience is drawn from working in a particular client environment. So how the heck do you differentiate these two? वो एक gray area है, उस पे debate चल रहे हैं, but I'm not sure how soon or far we are from any sort of legal framework.
Lovely. Okay. Shirish, there was a question here by Samir. I know you have answered it on the chat, but for the benefit of everybody, are there any specific types of gigable jobs? One is in terms of the functionalities, two is also in terms of the levels.
No, level does not make much of a difference, because today, honestly, within an organization also, when from a talent acquisition perspective or from HR perspective, when we hire people, we do not give the designation based on the year of experience a person carries, because if that needs to be done, most of the guys who crosses age of 40 needs to be at a D and above level, which becomes difficult at the times. And the pyramid collapses. So it's more of a competency being bring, it's a competency based framework. So as long as a person carries a competency, we would not mind giving that piece of work to any individual, even who carries less than 1 year experience, also who carries more than 8 years experience also. It's more on a competency they bring on the table for the respective role.
Okay, fair enough. And
let me quickly,
very quickly, just one question. Okay, fine, Deepak, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Colonel Saab, after you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because this is all new IT kind of a language, gigs and things like that. So how do you differentiate between a gig worker and a consultant? Because consultant may also be a core worker somewhere, his basic thing. Besides that, with the permission of his principal employer, he's working at 10 different places. So what's the difference between a gig and a consultant?
No, there isn't.
Differentiate.
So if that is your premise, Colonel Saab, that there is a consultant who's got a full-time, he or she for that matter is an FTE with, let us say, an enterprise or with a company. Right. And in her or his spare time, they are doing multiple other activities with the premise that they aren't in conflict with that first employer. They have every right to classify them as gig workers.
Yeah, exactly. So when it comes to IT, now having worked with the association for 6 years, there's a lot of kind of secrecy there. Like, a lot of jobs people would not like to be compromised or shared, the confidential rather. So can such people be doing gigs? Depends upon the basic company.
Yeah, well, a whole lot of factors, Colonel Saab, and I'll defer to Shirish and Sahil, but my two bits on this would be it's the skill sets or the competence area, the nature of the work. Now, is the work client facing for which you're using the gig worker, or is the work internal facing? Now, it's I don't have the data, although I did try to dredge for it, but we still don't have that level of what's it called, detailing, where what's the percentage of gig workers being deployed to do customer facing work?
Right.
DG, maybe Sahil can answer that question for us.
Yeah, so I was saying I'm going to defer to Sahil and Shirish.
Sahil, in your experience, what kind of jobs get gigged out? Are they client facing? Are they internal? Are they core? Are they, peripheral?
We've noticed that jobs which are quantifiable in nature and they do not hamper the data privacy issues at the organization. Those jobs are more there's a possibility, there's a higher possibility of them being gigified. But whenever the job includes, it's of a very subjective nature, and the dependency of that organization is extremely high on that kind of role. Those jobs the organizations want to keep in house, and I believe that's going to be the trend. I don't believe that really core jobs are going to be gigified, but most part of bulk hiring which happens, it happens for a quantifiable jobs, and those are going to be those are going to convert into as gig jobs.
Sure. And in the 4 years you've been in business, obviously volumes have grown multifold. But structurally, texturally, have the nature of jobs changed when you started and as we speak now, in terms of your profile?
Yeah, they have. For the first 3 years, we were more focused on jobs which required physical presence of somebody on a particular geography.
Yeah.
However, with pandemic, that has really changed.
Sure.
Now, suddenly there's 100 million workers in India which can work remotely for enterprises around the world, and they can work remotely. They don't need to go to some place, right?
Sure.
So the change that we've seen is in the last year, where there's a very dynamic shift from jobs which required somebody's physical presence to a job which does not now really require that. You can remotely work.
So work from anywhere kind of thing.
Work from
So the jobs that required physical presence, have they gone, or have they perforce been moved to not requiring physically?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, right? Jobs which had the possibility, which in our experience, most jobs had the possibility of, there was a possibility of innovation where the exact same outcome could have been achieved by somebody working remotely. But because, there was no disruption for so long, the same way that, cash was still there, UPI could have come like 10 years earlier also. But there was no disruption. There was no, there was nothing which force somebody to adopt a new way of work. The transition was slow, but this pandemic forced people to adopt this, and now when they have started using this model, they understand the benefits.
Lovely, lovely. Shirish, coming back to you, I think earlier DG raised a very important issue, that why do we need gig workers? So why does the IT industry need gig workers? Where does it start? Where did it start from? And what's the sustainability of that need?
Yeah, and before answering that, I can go back to Deepak's earlier question. He asked it right in terms of are this role are client facing or internal?
Yeah, yeah.
I can just cite one example. I myself, along with our leadership out here, we tried and practiced rather, and I can correlate that with this kind of a question. We were about to set up a R&D center for one of the recent company we acquired a year and a half back. Apparently companies into life sciences, and due to the last year's situation at a global level, the need of setting up R&D was at the highest priority, including that is the priority for the leadership, including CEO. When we had a meeting with the CEO, along with that, with the global leadership, we definitely introduce this concept where we have definitely get a senior person in that particular space to ensure that he talks to the client, he talks to the global level people, get engaged in the proposals in terms of setting up the R&D. Complexity involved because of, for example, given into R&D also in a short span of 6 months to set up R&D of 500 people with 90 different skill set combination. A few of the skill set, honestly speaking, being into the recruitment space, sometimes most of the terminology becomes new for us. When a client said, do you have a cockroach DB? I said, no, I either know cockroach or a DB, but combination of a cockroach DB works together as a new concept, as a terminology for us. So, a lot of this kind of a new concepts terminology keeps on coming in IT space. And every time you cannot keep on hiring the external talent or build a competency for that particular space. So this is exactly where you definitely make best use or make the best utilization of a gig economy, gig concept, because rather every time building up all the competencies within the organization, if that is the need of the hour for specific time period or a competency, you can always take that help, make the best proposal as a proposition, and I think we can deliver it together.
Lovely. Okay. And coming back to a question Deepak asked, and I'll ask you and go back to Deepak with his question only, in terms of why do we need these people? Where did it all start, and is it really sustainable?
Sustainability, yes, I could definitely say, rather I would see the need will go up because of the way a market is moving up. The kind of market dynamics are changing, and the complexities are increasing in terms of the kind of work being given in India as a geo. Not only from a perspective of what kind of deliverables are expected from India. We are no more just an offshore kind of a person, because I could relate that with the olden days where people used to definitely look at India as a cheap labor, and we can get the work done in less than X dollars than what it is used to be done in a global level. But today I could see that we put equal competency, we put the equal stake in the overall global growth, and this is where we definitely need all this competency, and I'm sure the gig economy or gig workers will put in that competency for the growth. And we as a IT industry, we as the organization, we all need this competency, and we need that perspective as well, which is equally important. And sometimes that perspective, that kind of vision may or may not be available within the organization. So in fact, organizations are open enough to understand what different ideas being bringing together to build the workforce of future. Yeah.
Sure. Is Mr. Srinivas Tata there? He wants to ask a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yeah, my question, most of it has in part has been answered. I'm just where I want to come in. While this is a fantastic concept, and it also gives you independence to so many.
Can you be a little louder, sir?
Can you hear me? Is it better?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm saying that while this gives a very good option for a lot of workers, the biggest challenge here is the regulation part. And until unless we don't have a clear regulation from Ministry of Corporate Affairs or so, it becomes very difficult for any individual in a job, because when you join a company, you are given a set of 5 pages for you to sign. Typically, you sign it, you don't know what are the clauses which are there. And the moment you go and take up a gig job, and subsequently your employer thinks that it is not right, you might be doing well, you will take up that clause to tell you to show you the door. So how do we regulate this part? Because that is the key for giving independence for people to be able to go and use their expertise, or rather take up a job which can, through which they can get a secondary income.
DG, how do we regulate? And like you've asked, who owns these gig workers?
Well, that's a very long discussion. But on the first one, it's a great point Srinivas is raising. And I wouldn't defer to, for regulations to kick in and offer some ministry to do its job. Look, if you look at the gig workers, well, okay, I'm not going to use the word gig workers, because if you look at, let's say, some of the millennials and the Gen Z, right, who are constituting a major part of, what is called as the gig economy, right? There are also, that having said, and I hope Advait brings up this subject later on, it's even people who are on the wrong side of the 50s who are now gig workers. And let's not forget that. And I hope, Advait, you pick this up, because that will make for a very interesting conversation. But let me come back to the point that Srinivas raised. So if you look at the millennials and the Gen Zs and the so on and so forth, even if they go into, let's say, a full-time, FTE job, these people, and with all due respects, they are very sharp. They will read through each and every clause, right? So it's not that they will just sort of blindly, sign up to any employment agreement. They are also, I think, fairly switched on, to use that word, Mr. Srinivas, to recognize which are the kind of activities that they can take up and will not be in conflict with their day. So they are very conscious when they take these decisions. Yes, of course, you will have a few outliers who may do it consciously, to spite the manager and so on and so forth. But then they very soon, come under the disciplinary action. But largely, by and large, you will see people are very conscious about, because at the end of the day, think about this. It's my brand equity as a gig worker, right? It's my name. It's my brand. And I don't want any harm, because any harm to come to my brand. So I will not do anything which will sort of take me in the dark corridors, and so that's the simple answer to, I hope, the question that you were raising.
I'll just pick up that point, DC, from you and ask Sahil that question, that do these reference checks happen? He talked about personal brand, which is actually a reputation or a reference check. When people come to you for gigs, or when you recommend and you sort of match the requirement with the gig worker?
Advait, in my opinion, I think that's where platforms like us add value to an organization, because when you work with us, and when you say leverage a network of gig workers through us, we have their entire past data, how many gigs they've worked in the past, what kind of outcome they what were their quality scores, etc. It's all recorded in our system. In fact, whenever somebody is uploading a requirement on our website, they get recommendations live, right?
Okay.
And this is basis the requirements that they have, and they can pick and choose which ones they want. So it's as simple as when you select an Uber driver, you want to check their ratings, right? So it's like that. So I completely agree with what Deepak is saying, and that's where platforms have an advantage. So that's how it is. It is important.
Okay. And like somebody is asking a question, how is it different then from just a manpower supplying kind of, team lease kind of company?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. A lot of HR people ask that. And I would also like to answer one of the previous questions, that why gig workers, right?
Okay.
I think it's all about business in the end. Everybody wants to be profitable. Everybody wants to have higher margins. What gig workers bring to the table is variable costs. That is number one. So your costs are variabilized. You don't pay a fixed cost, right? That's number one. Number two is it's faster to deploy. It's faster to deploy, and it's like fast, hire and fire. So suppose traditionally, if you want to scale to
so when you say faster to deploy, means the gig worker don't have a notice period to serve in the previous organization. They are available tomorrow or today.
Yeah, I think what we are currently focusing on is the type of a gig worker who's already working as an organization and now wants to take up additional. But I think the majority part of gig workers today don't have a primary job already.
Yes.
There are people who are okay with doing 5 different gigs for 5 different organizations. That's where majority of gig workers would eventually be. In fact, to answer, somebody asked this question, that how do you really regulate it? In my opinion, the need to regulate this is going to go low, because there's not going to be too many people even asking for it. People will just switch from a permanent job to a gig job. I think the idea of doing a permanent job with a gig job is lesser probable than doing a full-time gig job, right?
And in your experience, Sahil, are there regulars with these same companies?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
okay.
In fact, to just give an example, there have been so many cases where on our platform, there have been gig workers who continuously worked with us for last 3 years. Last 3 years, they've been working. And in fact, their earnings are as high as a lakh. And they're not just a lakh per month. And they're not just, they're highly experienced, there's 2, 3 years experienced people who otherwise wouldn't have been able to grow that ladder very fast in a typical organization. But since they have that spirit of hustle, they work hard, they build their score on the platform, and once somebody next comes with the requirement, the rate is higher.
Oh,
So
wow.
that is how it is like really enabling them.
I think the question you were asking, Advait, and that's a question which even Sam brought up earlier on in one of his comments. Look, if you work, so let's also differentiate the gig workers that Sahil is talking about. And I think the gig workers that, let's say, I and some of the
Traditionally work
others,
with, yeah.
right? So these would be your high skill experts, in the tech space, whether it's UX design, whether it's writing codes, writing content, or in the HR space, finance space, supply chain. I mean, the list is humongous, right?
Yeah.
And an Eklavya and his summary did put out some of those functional capabilities. Now, if you look at some of those capabilities, if the organization likes the work delivered by, let's say, freelancer stroke gig worker, you re-engage with them, right? It's not, and you bring them on a different project. In fact, in the professional advisory space, and not just professional advisory space, I see this with a lot of our clients. They create what are known as outsourced sticky teams. So these are people who are doing 10 different things. They're working with 10 different organizations. But they would be, if I was to call on them, uh, of course, depending on time, etc., they would say, yes, we would like to, be part of whatever engagement project that you're talking about.
Sure.
And that's the advantage. That's the point that Sahil made. That's where my costs go down, right? My cost of doing business goes down
Sure. Sure.
because
But
I'm.
DG, in your experience, your clients, have they made any changes in their HR policies, recruitment policies, practices to sort of incorporate this new channel, as Shirish calls them? And
Well,
I'll ask Shirish that question again from a practicing perspective.
true. I you see, okay, so has India HR sort of carved out specific HR policies to look at how to manage the so-called gig workers? There is not a great lot of evidence of
Okay.
that having been done, right? They are still treated as, contract workers who come on short-term contract and off they go.
Sure.
Because there are some regulatory requirements that you have to report back to the government, especially the kind of work that Sahil and his organization is doing with the clients. So, for example, now, well, okay, so that having said, in the times where the physical presence is required, let's say it's a plant, then the number of warm bodies on a plant at any particular day has to be reported back, right?
Sure. Sure.
But if it is now virtual, well, that requirement sort of gets diluted. But in the space that, let's say, we are talking about, whether it's tech, and Shirish can comment on that, or professional advisory, or even banking and the FSI sector or supply chain, these are people with high level of expertise. They come in as contracts, and it's on a fees. Now, whether the fees is on a daily basis, weekly basis, it's a matter of negotiation,
Sure.
and it gets reflected in your expenses, in your cost statement.
Sure.
But there
So,
isn't an HR,
yeah.
and that should take us to a very interesting conversation, hopefully somewhere down the line.
Sure. So, Shirish, we're talking of, have companies like you have started looking at gig workers. Have you required to make any changes in your policies, processes from an HR perspective, the way you look at the talent acquisition kind of process and policy?
So good part out here, yes, we are definitely looking at different composition, how we can definitely support business, because while yes, Deepak is right, certainly the HR has certain frameworks, certain policies, and definitely takes a long way to change every frameworks on that. Good part is, yes, I think the little bit of flexibility being given at a geo space, and wherein as long as it is going to make an impact to the business and we onboard business, then there is there is a scope, there is a flexibility being given that we can definitely do it within the framework, but what flexibility we can use it. But I think the mindset as well as the approach is changing to see to it that while we made these policies or we are having these structures, but not at the cost of hitting the business. End of the day, if business priority is going to work for that, I think we are flexible.
But
see, okay, Advait, sorry, just very quickly, let's look at now. Yes, on the blue collars, there is a a new regulation that's in the pipe. But if you look at the white collars, there is no regulation there. There's nothing mandatory. Although there is now a big debate that medical support, statutory leaves, and so on and so forth needs to kick in even when you do white collar gig workers. But as of today, there isn't anything. So therefore, for the corporates, businesses who bring in white collar gig workers, right, you don't have to change your HR structure, your policies, and your regulations. Fundamentally, they don't have to undergo a change. Something else needs to undergo a change, and I hope we talk about that. And that is, how do we engage with this crew?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. What kind of changes do our leaders who are, when I say leaders, I mean, every manager is a leader kind of a thing. Because our managers are so entrenched in that, using the hierarchy to get the work done. That's the reality, right? I mean, much as we might want to talk about other things, with the gig worker, that isn't going to work because she or he is here not responding to a hierarchy. She or he is in the gig environment because of either it's the nature of the work or they like that company. They like what that company stands for. They like the purpose of that company and it aligns with their own purpose. I think that is the conversation that a lot of organizations are beginning to have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The question I wanted to ask you, Shirish, going back to you is that, say, for example, if I take you back 2-3 months ago, have your business leaders started budgeting for gig workers for the next year? Or is it ad hoc? Is it random? Is it of the spur of the moment?
No, right now we haven't planned it that way. Having said that, honestly, the current big question with the leaders is how to bring back people to the work. And and when we say bring back people to the work is converse exactly adverse what we are talking about, but it's not more on a physical bringing back, it's more of a getting to the same mindset that yes, I think we have a deliverables and how we need to ensure that so that is the business priority. But yeah, that was
so we're still far away from budgeting for gig work.
We are still far away from budgeting on that. That's right.
Sahil, there was this discussion in terms of the nature of work that gig workers are, and I would imagine that on your portal, most of your workers are like what DG mentioned, the millennials and Z, or you have, if I go back to the intern movie kind of example, where there are 50-year-olds like me and all of us actually, and not you, Sahil, who are also want to sort of do the internship on a gig kind of thing. What kind of profile you have here?
Advait, about 60% of our gig worker network is in the age group of 25 to 35 years old.
Okay.
And about 30% of it is from 18 to 21.
So there's still some hope. Okay.
And there are a few who are in the age group of 50 plus. So, but the adoption, the highest adoption that we are seeing at our platform is from the Gen Zs and the millennials.
So Shirish, DG, and I note to myself, it's going to be difficult for us to do gigs.
No. It's easy for us to do gigs. Believe me, Advait.
Yeah, because we don't have any competition there.
No, it's not a question of well, yeah, well, I'd love to believe that, Shirish. I don't know whether this panel would, have the patience to, go through this rambling, but, because if you look at, people like Advait, yourself, Shirish, and a whole lot of others who are on the wrong side of the 50s, assuming they have a certain level of expertise, right, which they can offer, whether it's in the F&A space or the HR space or supply chain space. It actually is entirely on to us to shed the mindset that, oh, I'm a CEO or a GM, and develop a mindset that I can go back and work as an individual contributor. The moment you're able to make that shift, that I am very comfortable working as an individual contributor, then I can go and hawk my expertise, and organizations actually want that. And there are specific kind of organizations. And I'm not going to talk about the ones going through transformation, blah, blah, blah. That sounds like consulting speak. But, organizations which are looking for rapid growth, they're small organizations, they're looking for rapid growth. They want that expertise, not at the suite, at the C-suite. They want the expertise where the action matters, where the execution happens, where the decisions are being taken when you are in front of the customer or the client or whatever the heck you're doing. And that is where they bring the senior expertise who are very good working as individual contributors.
Sure.
And I have seen, and I've had the privilege of working with a couple of those organizations, and they deliver magic.
Yeah.
Now, of course, sitting behind this is a whole new mindset that has to be on both the giver side, which is folks, old haggards like us, as well as the existing leadership within those organizations and their ability to work with experts who were CEOs in their erstwhile roles, are now acting as individual contributors. It's a new world. So don't despair. We have a lot of opportunity.
That's a good thing to say. One more thing that especially has been in a lot of talked about, especially because of the pandemic and the effect it has on jobs, even in the IT sector. And Sahil, I'll start with you on that. That is there a bias favorably or unfavorably towards women gig workers versus men gig workers across the age groups that you have seen, or what's been your experience?
Okay, so as a fact, with pre-COVID percentage of gig workers on our platform who were women was just 12%. Now it's at 44%.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it has increased exponentially, and in fact, the number of gig workers have also increased. So you can imagine the number of women gig workers have increased.
And how does this percentage do in terms of actual gigs, the absorption?
Sorry, in gig consumption, you're saying?
Yeah.
Actually, we've grown about 2x in the last 1 year itself. So there's a double work that has been done. So you can imagine that 12% of X, 44% of X, 2x is marginally quite a lot. But the point that I'm trying to make is that when pre-COVID, the requirement of a gig worker was very geo-specific. It was dominated by the male side of the male side of community. However, since now remote work is more open and companies are more okay with people working remotely, it gives an advantage to women gig workers to have an advantage here. In fact, I don't know, we've not noticed this at our platform. The pay is extremely equal because it's completely outcome based.
Wow.
Right? So there's no difference between what a male gig worker runs or a female gig worker. It's completely purely based on the outcome of work.
Lovely.
Female male does not matter. Yeah.
Shirish, you have to add on that?
Yeah, in fact, I agree with Sahil. I don't see there is any biasness or there is any differentiator in terms of any of the inclusions part or diversity part of it. It's more of a competency. So it's equal, it's fair. And I could see, yes, trend is moving towards certainly it is more on the diversity part. Certainly there is good talent coming, and of course with the natural instinct that they can do multifaceted things. So I think, yeah, I mean, and industry is quite appreciative about it. I mean, there is
Lovely. DG, going back to this topic that is coming up again and again in our discussion, which we've not yet fully addressed, as well as some of the questions that I can see on chat, is from a corporate HR perspective, should you consider your gig workers as good as your employees from an employee engagement and kind of perspective, or how should business leaders and HR leaders react to this new phenomenon that is here to stay?
Well, the simple answer is yes.
Okay.
So from an engagement point of view, you've got to engage with your gig workers with the same mindset as you would do with their FTEs. Because at the end of the day, Now, again, I'm making a difference here, right? So Sahil's maybe output stroke outcome, uh, the gig workers that I am referring to, let's say whether it's in the HR space or let's say in the supply chain space, you come in and you say, okay, I can look at your entire warehousing and I can advise you as to, what needs to be done, what technology implementation, etc., etc. Your ability to engage with them has to be the same, right? They can't be treated as oh, what's his name that walked into my office yesterday? No, you can't be making those statements, right? And therefore, actually, the burden, it's on both sides, but let's talk about us. The burden is more on us as business managers, right? We have to think differently. In fact, one of the biggest challenges that I foresee coming is you have these different segments of workforce in your environment. You have your FTEs, you have your contracts, and you have your gigs, right? Each one of them will require a different lens with which you engage with them. So it's the business managers who are really going to be challenged. They will need to bring about a very significant and very quick shift in their mind, in the way they think. The typical, many years ago, I was dear friend of mine, CEO of Carbon Black and so on and so forth. He says the advantage I have is that I had the business. I'm sitting at the top of, people will listen to me. There is a hierarchy.
Yeah.
Right. But can you use the same hierarchy mindset to engage with the gig worker? There's a question mark. I don't think, I would, my instinct will tell me no, because they will not respond to hierarchy. Because what is their driver? What is their motive of, engaging with you in that initiative of 3 months, 6 months, 2 weeks, whatever? It's entirely different.
Sure.
Right.
Sure. That actually brings me to a point, Shirish. I want to just question that, employee engagement models have had to force change thanks to the pandemic, because most of the work went virtual. Now with these gig people, you don't know them. Even if that worker is, that gig person is doing a first project with you, you don't know he's as good as a new employee, and you don't know that after 2 months, 3 months, whatever, that person perhaps will never work for you. How do you adapt your engagement models, one, from physical to virtual? Perhaps most of the companies have already tried to do that, and how do you extend that to gig workers now? What's your view on it? What has your company been doing?
Yeah, so as you rightly mentioned, yes, whether they are a part of employee or whether they are a gig or even they are maybe temporary in nature as a worker, as a end of the day, it's a matter of they are part of the ecosystem. So it's not that we mindset wise bifurcate them. While giving the work also, we do not bifurcate them because we expect them to contribute. So end of the day, our perspective or approach doesn't change. In fact, I could see because of the pandemic last year, major of my L&D function, including my HR business partner, were so active. And in fact, most of them have become more strategic and vigilant in terms of how we can bring a different change attached to it. And I can proudly share that within one of the global R&D activity, when each of the business, we do a forward kind of a thing that each of the business units supposed to do a project, and that gets ranked at a global level. And out of the top 3 projects, 2 projects being ranked by HR being done by India. And one of them was the employee engagement activity, how we did it virtually. So we did not bifurcate, and I could see that it's more of involving them in your ecosystem is more important. And I think there is no change, there is no way we can differentiate them rather.
Sure. I think we are running out of time. So one final question, Sahil, to you.
Yeah.
You're in a unique position where you obviously have or they have your ear in terms of both corporates as well as gig workers. So my question to you is, what are those unmet expectations from corporates who are looking for gig workers, and what are those unmet expectations from gig workers from corporates?
It's a good question. Let me start with the corporate side. I think one key challenge that we keep facing is, in some requirements there's a requirement of deploying some kind of logistics to gig workers or working remotely. And since the concept on which we run, it's more of a remote basis where deployment of these logistics becomes a challenge. So that is number one. Number
Okay.
two is some organizations are extremely stringent when it comes to data. So the expectation is that when you have a full-time employee, you trust that employer, you have certain arrangements in place which ensure that data is secured.
Sure.
As soon as you move to a gig model, there's a question mark. So I think those two are few key challenges that corporates still have expectations, and we as a platform are trying to figure out what's the best solution to that. And
Sure.
on the gig worker side, I think one key challenge that they have is, which I think is kind of solved with this new social security code, was with the added benefits. There were no added benefits, but I think now there will be. And number
Sure.
two is, despite the pandemic breaking our beliefs that we have a job security, but with a full-time job, you always have the security that, hey, by the end of the month, I'm going to get a salary, right? But with gig
Yeah.
work, you are always in doubt.
Sure.
So I think the expectation is, how can I get some minimum wage as a fixed salary while I work on the side hustle? So I think that is that is
So
some.
that's a slightly vague expectation of being, being able to balance both, fixed salary plus huge upside. Okay, great. For final, one question to each one of you, starting with Sahil, since you're already on screen. Where do you see the future?
I believe that.
Or like the panel, I sort of named the panel discussion as, is gig the future of the economy in India?
Yeah, I think as on a global level, we're already seeing that gig is the future in geographies like US, Japan, and more geographies where disposable income is high. So I believe with time, when India's per capita income keeps growing and disposable income becomes higher, more and more people will become gig workers, and that's
Okay,
going to be the future. Office sizes are going to get smaller. In fact,
sure.
even post pandemic, a lot of HRs and organizations are saying we don't need this large office, right? We can just we can keep it 2 days a week and cut down our costs on the offices. So I believe that is definitely going to be a
Yeah, I
future.
think it's a fair point because a couple of our clients as well have cut down on their real estate space and now have said that we are starting flexi working, and it is not going to be more than 2 days in office per week for everybody. So you fix your 2 days, and obviously it's hot desking. So yeah, that's a big trend. Yes, Deepak.
Just a quick one, and wearing my psychologist hat, you see,
Yeah,
one of the biggest drivers of that this gig economy will rapidly grow is the concept of instant gratification.
uh,
And if you look at all the social platforms that and media that we surround ourselves with, and if you overlay that with, look at the millennials, the Gen Zs, and what the heck, I mean, even if you look at Gen X and Gen Y, those of us who are still around, it's all about instant gratification.
yeah,
And the gig economy allows you to achieve that.
yeah, yeah.
Right. And therefore, and I've seen this, I mean, and all of us, we've done stints abroad and so on, and we've mixed with other cultures. You see this increasingly. There is this trend towards saying, I'm not going to bloody wait till I become 60 to buy my Lamborghini or my, I don't know, whatever the heck we call these days. I want my Lamborghini now. So
Yeah,
these
yeah,
guys they will hustle.
yeah, yeah.
Right. They will do multiple initiatives. They will work multiple sort of projects. Now,
Sure.
the downside is, and that's something that needs to be really thought about. And I don't know if you've been following this big debate, the California Assembly Bill 5 and the way it was beaten down by Uber and Lyft by spending $200 million, and the referendum said, okay, to hell with it.
Yeah.
Are we looking at gig workers to cut cost? Are we hiring gig workers because they're cheaper? Because if we continue to have that as the dominant mindset, we're going to it's going to come back and bite us in the wrong part of our anatomies. But if we
Yeah.
are looking at gig workers to bring in that expertise,
Yeah.
You know, we want that expertise to come in, make an impact, contribute as an individual contributor. Then it's not about money. Yes, of course, I'll save on my referrals and my medicals and so on and so forth. But that is going to become the next talking point.
It boils down to whether you're hiring a body or a brain.
Right. Gig working is not about warm bodies. In certain sections, yes.
Yeah.
But largely, and I'm hoping, pray to God that does become a reality. It is about hiring expertise. It's hiring experience.
Sure.
So there again, I'm making a business case for people like you and I, Advait.
Shirish, final words for the panel today.
So I think, yeah, the future is there, and yes, most of us are gearing towards it. As you rightly mentioned, I don't think it's just a generation X or Y, as rightly said by Deepak. I think each one of us has a role to play. It just depends on what kind of a hat we wear, how we change the mindsets, and we can do that. I mean, I can just share my experience last 1 year with the pandemic is quickly. After 8 o'clock, after most of the US and other calls are getting over, I definitely started playing a role to teach my teams within HR that how we can get into global investments, including how to invest in the GameStop and still make $1,000 in a day. And including myself, I made it, and I told my HR team also that stop looking your pay slips and wait for the last SMS to come on a last working day. You know how you can make yourself more empowered and how to bring that wisdom also rather than looking at only as a wisdom. You know.
Sure.
So yeah, I think we are gearing towards it.
Thanks Shirish, thanks Deepak, thanks Sahil. Samir, over to you.
Thanks everyone for this extremely engaging conversation today. And I think amongst all our sessions so far, Advait, this was perhaps one of the most engaging, actively participated session, which I thought, because it invoked so much of it struck a chord with everyone, and there were so many aspects which it touched upon.
Sure.
So thank you once
Thanks,
again
Samir, for
for
choosing the right
moderating.
topic.
And thank you for moderating this so well, and thank all the esteemed panelists, Shirish, DG, and Sahil, to have spared your precious time for this conversation. On behalf of HIA, I would like to thank everyone for participating in this, and Advait, really looking forward to our next session in the coming quarter.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And enjoy evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Samir, and thanks
Bye.
all. Nice pleasure meeting you all.
Bye.
Yes. Bye-bye.